Yes, our next guest speaker is Nelson Santiago. Nelson, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All righty, thank you very much, Ray. So good morning, everyone. I'm Nelson Santiago, and I'm currently a coordinator at NC State in the Wellness and Recreation Department. I actually come from Florida. My bachelor's and master's degree I got at the University of Central Florida. My bachelor's was in sports and fitness, and then I wound up getting my master's in higher education. My whole background and everything I had done up to college and even getting my degree was all in sports and fitness and wellness. But when I decided to go and get my master's in higher education, that's when I really fell in love with this concept of inclusion. I think it's really simple to have diversity because you just have two people together and you have diversity there because we all carry differences. But that next level of inclusion and making people feel welcome was the piece that I really wanted to focus my career on. Working at a gym like I did even in undergrad and grad, I didn't think about the barriers that we had because I'm able-bodied, and I didn't think about, wow, what if someone in a wheelchair wanted to come and work out here? What if someone who was completely blind wanted to work out here? Even just the visual of having to climb these big staircase and to get into the facility and no markings for where the elevator was were the things that our director put me in charge of. I was in charge of creating this bridge between our facility and special populations. So that goes into what I'm going to be speaking about today with the barriers kids of color face in outdoor recreation. So whenever we're thinking about these type of things and who's missing, that's the first thing we have to ask is who is missing, right? So in this one, if it's kids of color in outdoor recreation, we have to have the thought in our head to even be asking that question. And we need to have people at the table that have that mindset and can start to think about who's missing. Because, right, like at the end of the day, whether it's in the university or out in parks and recs, like our programming is for everyone. It's something we welcome all to, but if everyone isn't coming, there's a reason, and that's the access piece. And we have to really think about access, and we got to think about how are we intentionally creating access. So one of the things that I see as a barrier for kids of color when it comes to outdoor recreation is if their families and their parents and their older siblings weren't participating in outdoor recreation, then that's the first barrier right there. Because I think that a lot of us are led, at least in our early childhood, by our guardians, by our families, by the people that we're around. And if our parents and our families weren't outdoors, like myself, my dad is one of 12 kids born and raised in the projects in Boston. And my mom's one of 7 kids. She's from Guatemala, and then moved to the United States and in California and LA, where I was born in Los Angeles. Like they weren't doing outdoor recreation. So, and all the people we hung out with, all the people from the church, that's not what they were doing. So from the beginning, that piece of access and that piece of, hey, want to go canoeing, or do you want to go on some of these things as Jamie presented? Like no one was asking me that. No one was coming to my church and presenting that. No one was coming to my neighborhood and presenting that. And, until I came to NC State, really that wasn't even something that was presented to me to specific for me, for a person like myself. And I'll talk about how that was done and how it's being done annually at NC State. But it just wasn't it was out of sight, out of mind. And I didn't know what I was missing from the great outdoors that I now do. So, um, you know, another piece of, this access, if there's not this true access, then there's exclusion, right? So whenever I've seen camping on TV, or when I think of like how the media presents camping in the wilderness and the great outdoors, I don't think of black and brown kids. I don't think of me. I don't see me, and that's another important thing too, right? Like if we're doing marketing, if we're presenting photos, if we're trying to go into communities of color and say, hey, we want you there, and all our pictures are all white faces, then where am I? Where am I? So these are things that we have to be very mindful of, is how are we reaching out intentionally to the communities that aren't being represented? And that's in anything that we do, right? Currently, we are not the target audience. Kids of color aren't the target audience. Um, and if we are going to make them the target audience, then we have to change some of these things that we are currently doing. And then you also think of what other fears, which was also talked about in the presentation before, is, and all children can have this, and all people can have this, but there is a fear of the outdoors if it's unknown. And if you don't have your parents or your loved ones to tell you different, it might be because they're scared too. And they might have even instilled some of those fears. I remember even when I was telling my mother that I was going on the trip that I just went to Louisiana, she brought up some of the same fears that some of the students that came with us had, which was, "Ooh, aren't you scared of being out there and the animals and the bugs?" And I remember one of the nights speaking to her, and I said, "The only animal I've seen is a raccoon." And she still got scared. She was like, "Don't they have rabies?" And I'm like, "I'm sure they possibly can, but I'm not scared." So, there has to be this like next level of education, right? It's not even just educating the child, it's educating the parents, because the parents and the guardians are going to be the ones that allow these children to participate in these outdoor recreation. So we have to know what their fears and their barriers are in their mind, because I'm sure most of the people on this call are in love with the outdoors, so those fears aren't there. But we have to really sit down with the people who are afraid, know those fears, so that we can break down those barriers that we bring to the table when you're trying to take us into the unknown. So, and I, preparing for this presentation and this discussion, I started talking to some of my friends. We're all in our mid 30s, and almost, it's a large friend group, and I just pulled all like the men of color, and I'm like, all righty, guys, talk to me about the outdoors. Have any of you camped? Have any of you, gone canoeing and all these things? And out of all my friend group, only one of my friends had gone, and he had only gone one time. So, and then the other guys, they were like, nope, no interest. And I was like, well, don't you think it's awesome that you could like camp on a beach in the sand and you can hear the ocean coming in? Because that was part of my experience. And my other buddy said, that sounds like a nightmare to me. And I'm like, what? A nightmare? It's amazing. So like, these are things that are ingrained so deep in their minds that really made me realize that it is the children. It is the children that we have to target. It is the parents we have to educate, because these are the same people that are going to have children to grow up and either be fearful of the outdoors or embrace the outdoors. So, and even my buddy that told me he's like, I just have zero interest. That also got me to thinking, well, yeah, like if there's something that you've never done, never cared to do, never been presented, and now you are in your mid 30s and you have a child, like he does, and his wife, I was like, yeah, then then why would he have his daughter go do that? And why would they send baby Mac out into the outdoors if as parents there's zero interest there, and there's fears. Parents aren't going to put their children at risk, but there's way more pros than as long as we're safe and we're educated and anything, there's not much to be fearful of. And that's something that I learned on the trip that I went on, which I'll, like I said, speak a little bit more in in a couple of minutes. But when you also think of other barriers, it's expensive. The equipment that we used, even the light on, you put on your headlamp, it's 15-20 bucks. I'm sure you could find them used and cheaper, but like, the pants that I wore, like for canoeing, they're like $88. The socks that keep your feet warm and dry quickly, which also come from the outdoor shops, those are like $10 a piece. Let alone a tent and the stove that you bring out there, and the canoes, and then having a vehicle that can actually pull the canoes. It's just really expensive. And if we're going into lower socioeconomic status homes, currently in our country, a lot of those homes are people of color, and that comes from also lack of access to education and other resources. But that's a different topic. That's not what we're talking about today. But they do go hand in hand, and so if we don't have the equipment, we don't have the finances, we don't have our parents saying, "Hey, go ahead and do that." If there's no intentional efforts by our local parks and recs, if there's no intentional efforts by our universities, if there's no intentional efforts by our schools, this will stay the pattern, just like any other pattern that we see in life. So now that we've spoken about some of these barriers, and trust me, there's way more, and I'm sure you all can think of plenty of other barriers as well. The next portion of this is the importance of diversity and equity in outdoor recreation, right? Like like the book we were reading on the trip, like, who cares? Like, what's the big deal? Like, a lot of people say that, like, what's the big deal? Like, why do we need this? Why do we need diversity in the outdoors? Why do we need equity? I'm gonna share a little bit of my experience on a trip that we put on in wellness and recreation through outdoor adventures, which is called the Dive Trip, which stands for Diversity and Inclusion Adventure Experience. So, like I was talking about earlier, it's something that is done every year during spring break. Um, it's a social justice meets the great outdoors mashup, which is awesome, which is, of course, what sparked my interest. And it's no cost to the students. They have to apply to be able to go on the trip, and then there's no cost if they're selected. It's absolutely free for them. There are 2 stops that we made where students could go buy food if they wanted to, but we had plenty of food for the students who were on this trip. And it was a 9-day trip that started on that Friday that spring break begun, and we drive all the way out to Louisiana, and we get there in 2 days, and we cross 6 states to get out there. And you have predominantly students of color on this trip, international students on the trip, and then even some white students who just really want to broaden their horizons and get deeper into this space of inclusion, and understanding that they want other people to feel welcome outside of their traditional community with the outdoors. And we sleep in tents every single night. We went all the way to Grand Isle, Louisiana, which is on the outer banks of Louisiana, where there's a lot of land erosion. And that was part of the trip too. It's like this educational part of how this is happening, why is it happening, and how people are the ones causing this. And then how the communities that are being affected are people of color as well as Native American communities and how they've lost so much land. And there's a lot more to that educational part. But I think that a lot of the people on this call can create these experiences in their local communities. I don't think you have to go all the way to Louisiana to learn about some of these inequities, and also have like this immersion of outdoor adventuring and excitement of being outdoors. And for myself, once again, who had never camped, and here I am about to sleep in a tent for the first night. It was cold. It was about 30 degrees, and the wind was blowing very, very hard. And thankfully, that was the worst night of it. But it from that first night, I remember in my tent journaling and just being like, "Wow, like I love this. This is great." Like even though it was cold and even though it was a little scary, I immediately clicked with the experience and knew that it would be something that I wanted to do again. And I also thought, wow, why haven't I done this yet? But once again, thankfully, there was this access created. There was this program targeted for me and people like me. And to see all these students also first time being in a tent and then talking about it the next day was excellent, because no one wanted to go home that next day. They stayed on the journey. And that was just such a great thing. But something that I think NC State and Wellness and Recreation did really well with is that once all of us were selected that we were going on this trip, we had pre-trip meetings. One was to get to meet everyone that was around us and get to know each other. But there were some people, for instance, that had never canoed, didn't know how to swim, had fears about the bugs and the animals that were out there, and then the survival aspect. So we were able to really be educated. We got in the pool, practiced canoeing. We got in the pool, got our life jackets on, felt how it was to be in a life jacket and just let your body go. So those fears were being broken down before we even left a space that we were familiar with, which was our university. And there are plenty of students and people in your areas that come to your community center that could be the space that you begin to create this comfort and break down those barriers that are in their mind and their parents' mind. You can invite them to come to this, to create this equity, to create this space where we can have more diverse groups going to the outdoors. It can be created in this space that's familiar with them over, depending on whatever works for you all. But for us, it was several weeks out. Actually, it was 2 months out. We were just meeting regularly, and we were able to already create a trust amongst ourselves, create a trust in the equipment, because as you learned how to canoe, as you learned that these life jackets were very secure, and that I can swim, but if I was stranded for a while, I would, I think I'd still be okay. But with that life jacket on, I knew I'd be okay. So those are things that just create empowerment and created a sense of security. And I thought it was also really cool that we did get to talk about our fears, and we did get to talk about what we were nervous about, and then to have a leader in the space and have leaders in the space and people who have experienced this before be able to share the truth of the outdoors and the truth of the experience and the truth of what we were going to expect and see. And right, like we couldn't control the weather that night, but we had equipment that we could use to keep us warmer. The leaders had already looked up what the weather was going to be like, so that we could have everything we needed if it came our way. So I think that was extremely empowering, beneficial, probably the reason why most people felt as comfortable as they did moving forward. But And then of course, once we did get out there, there were so many benefits of the outdoors, the peace and serenity that it provided. It's a natural workout. We were walking a lot, and you didn't even realize it, that in that day you could walk 3, 5, 6, 7 miles, and it just go by like this. The survival aspect, like, it was cool to now know, like, oh, I now know how to cook outdoors if I needed to, or I know how to put up a tent, or um I just know how to be out in nature for 9 days and survive, and know that I'm going to be okay. It stimulated my mind. It made me very curious. It gave me a deeper understanding of the world I lived in. And then I was encouraged to journal daily, which I think is an extremely valuable component of this. And, to kind of wrap up this whole piece of diversity and equity is, um, why should that not be a shared experience? Why should kids of color, people of color, not have that access to the great outdoors? Why should we, as professionals who have some resources and have the ability to create access, why should we not want to do that? Just like in the workplace and in our world and in our country, it's about uniting and creating inclusive spaces wherever we're at. So my question would be, why not? Why would we not do this, especially if we can? And there are, of course, barriers with finance, but there's a lot of resources out there that we can get. There are grants. There are universities like ours that do trips like this, and I think that if we want it, we can make it happen, right? It's kind of like going back to the original story of me being this liaison between our rec center and populations that aren't currently in our space, special populations, right? It was having to go to these individuals, go to these groups, and bring them in, by there to say, yo, you're gonna be okay. It's gonna be fine. And that's what this trip did for me. It created this inclusiveness by sitting us down, having these meetings, getting all the fears out of our heads, and being able to enjoy outdoor recreation. That's all I have.